So you want to know about Limbus Company. I know about Limbus Company. Welcome. I'm Esku. This is the Uptie 4 tier list done as efficiently as possible. Right, don't waste time, mine are yours. I'm going to go through all 62 IDs as fast as possible. Yes, this is as fast as I could go, you'll see why. Before you get upset about my opinions, just know you legally have to listen to me if your railway turn count is higher than 80. It's in the Limbus Company Bible, don't want to upset the big man. I'm assuming everyone is familiar with how tier lists work, but this one will be slightly different. I will quickly explain my 3 criteria for my placements. Criteria number 1. How much value are you getting from this Uptie 4? Specifically, this means the jump in quality from Uptie 3 to Uptie 4. This usually takes the form of higher numbers for damage and clashing, which will matter more or less depending on the ID. IDs that went from garbage to usable are also generally going to be a bit higher than IDs that were good and only got a little good-er. This way, you get the most bang for your buck. But of course, do not just uptie an ID because they gained a lot of value. Some IDs are meant to be niche. Consider if you are going to actually need the niche the ID fills. What rarity are they? This holds less weight than the first criteria and is pretty self-explanatory. Uptie 4 costs a lot, and it costs less, still a lot, for 0/0 and base IDs. This tier list is all about value, so a character who gets a good buff for cheaper is going to be a better deal than a 0/0 ID that gets the same good buff. Also, just because a Sinner has many good options for Uptie 4 doesn't mean the worst options are placed arbitrarily lower, due to using the same shards. Not everyone is going to have access to every ID, therefore I'll rank every ID as fairly as I can bring myself to. And number 3, Railway content. Railway is the peak of difficult content and is focused on going as fast as possible. IDs that gain a significant amount of burst damage or more access to their burst damage from Uptie 4 gain a small boost to their value. This is weighted the least heavy out of the 3, but it is still important to mention. Got all that? Good, we're almost done with the intro. One last thing, the following graphics for the Upties will only list the changes they received from Uptie 3 to 4. I will show Uptie 3 skill descriptions if necessary, but I made this video assuming you are mostly familiar with an ID's Uptie 3 state. Now, let's start with... The F tier is reserved for the worst of the worst. These are the IDs that you uptie because you either hate yourself or really love them. Either way, here's your free reality check. I'll be going through these pretty quick since they suck. Starting off the F tier, yikes. Chef Ryoshu is a strong character before Uptie 4, but this is just a slap in the face. Gaining Lust on Evade is the biggest buff here, and that is meant to be this universal small buff given to every ID. What's that? She gains 1 more appetite on her skill 1. Her skill 2 gives 1 more bleed and an appetite on use. You mean the effect that will rarely proc ever. Yes, they gave her 1 more healing down, but the jump from 30% to 40% does not make it worth the 150 thread and 50 Ryoshu shards. Unless you feel like burning resources in a concept incinerator, in which case, go right ahead. This is the worst value on an Uptie 4 by far. The first of the 12 base IDs, and alright, that's it. Just +1 across the board. Lot to take in, I know, but base Faust really just isn't good for anything besides the 2 attack power down on her skill 3, which is present in Uptie 3. This Uptie is worthless. This buff is the most forgettable thing I've ever seen. The only relevant buff here is making the skill 2 roll 13, and even that is just alright. The skill 3 buff is practically non-existent. Save your resources, don't uptie Otis, no matter how funny the purpose of the Odyssey is. Yep, +1 to his skill floors, and some rupture. There just isn't much to say about the majority of base ID buffs, and what can I say? The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Base Honglu was already one of the better base IDs, so it makes sense his Uptie 4 doesn't give him much. Some splattering of rupture and sinking does not change Honglu in any significant way. If War 1's base power had not been raised by 1, this may have been even lower. Not gonna sugarcoat it, I hate this buff. The shield increase from 5% to 10% is nice and all, but every single buff to a skill is a clash lose effect. This buff decides to ignore what Sloshing Ishmael's problem is, and that's being actively bad for Tremor teams, with her skill 3 reducing Tremor count by 4. Instead they just give her aggro. I understand the idea is you want to actually lose clashes, gives you the shield and the clash lose benefits, but counterpoint, why not just win those clashes and do cool effects on hit like every other ID in the game? Sloshing Ishmael's buff is interesting in concept, but it really should have just stayed a concept. Do not waste your Ishmael shards on this, every other one of her upties is better than this. Okay, fine, this isn't much better than sloshing, but still, I did not lie. Speaking of this buff, yeah, everything increases by 1 or 2. The problem here is that the effects that were already on the skills just aren't good enough to have this be sufficient. For real this time, every other Ishmael Uptie is significantly better than this. Do I need to say anything? Look at this garbage. 10 plus bleed count for +1 coin power. Okay, you get it. But what about the rest of the buff? Yeah, I can get +3 coin power on my skill 2? Wow, oh my god, how great. The skill 1 buff exists, but look. It's terrible. D tier is for the bad options. Not as egregious as the F tier, but still take some time for self-reflection and call your doctor to see if these IDs are right for you. The D tier starts with a once controversial Uptie 4. Thankfully now, Red Sheet Sinclair actually has a buff that does not completely undermine his kit. That being said, the buffs he did receive are bad. His base kit is solid enough on its own, this only lets him go a little bit faster. Well, at least he has an Uptie 4 now, as opposed to having a very expensive regression. I used to think that Blade Lineage Otis was underrated, but now she's just bad, especially compared to the rest of the IDs. Otis just does not gain enough significant poise count generation. +2 does technically make it possible to maintain poise, but you need a completely optimal rotation of skills and no crits. A 13 roll on the skill 1 is the only real benefit you would get anyways. Definitely one of the Uptie 4s I was most disappointed by. This Uptie 4 feels like a placebo. You could have convinced me this was the same kit as Uptie 3 Basey sang. The buff to his skill 3 is nice, and it is the main reason he crawls out of the F tier, since it allows him to roll a 12 instead of a pathetic 9. Oh, and his sinking application also increases, but really, who cares? Pre-Uptie 4, Base Sinclair was praised as one of the better base IDs. Sad to say it, but Uptie 4 does not fix Base Sinclair's problems. His skill 2 still rolls a 10, making it hard to fulfill his plus 30% extra damage on Clash win condition. The skill 3 has also gained coin power, allowing it to roll a 14 instead of an 11. This is the main reason he is in the prestigious D tier. However, it's just not worth it. You could find a replacement for Base Sinclair almost anywhere. The 3 Rupture is not unique, nor is decent damage. I don't know if this is controversial, but Protection is one of those effects that feels just okay to use. You know you're taking less damage, but it doesn't feel good. Zwei Sinclair heavily leans into that, well, if I'm hit, at least I'm not hit as hard philosophy. Buffing his skill 2 to roll a 10 makes almost no difference in clashes. It seems almost intentional, since he has the clash loss like Zwei Rodian and Sloshmail. Though unlike Zwei Rodian, his damage still sucks. At least he was given guaranteed tremor support on his skill 2. The worst part is that his blunt fragility wasn't even changed to apply next turn on his skill 3. Considering his speed range, that extra 20% blunt damage will still never be taken advantage of. Aggro is the saving grace of this buff, allowing the protection stacking to feel potentially meaningful. Still D tier. So Kurukuma Honglu got a small buff to his base power and a little bit more bleed. I mean, that's cool and all, but let's be real. That doesn't matter. You are using Kurukuma Honglu for Cloud Cutter. Cloud Cutter is about the same at Uptie 3. Don't waste your time, unless you really like pressing the funny blue button and are tired of the other non-Cloud Cutters being a bit weaker than they could be. Based on? Based on what? Thank you so much, I'll be here all night. Take you later. Bleed. She's based on bleed. That's right, the pure damage ID that was based on Quixote is now a bleed ID, and a very meh one at that. Her clashing numbers are a bit better, especially 16 ceiling skill 2, though the core of her kit is about being the fast little gremlin girl, as shown in her skill 3. And she still cannot achieve this without Isang base ego and or Geoda's passive. I banished Based On to the D tier. Jefe de los Mariachis is one of the few tank IDs to not gain any of the aggro mechanic. This severely hurts him, since the buff to his evade implies you want to evade as many attacks as possible to stack up poise count. In the current state, you're only likely to evade one attack, which is worthless since the one poise count would then be immediately spent on turn end. The extra coin power when there is sinking on the opponent is a nice benefit, but since he is so horribly slow, taking advantage of sinking is harder. This was close to a good buff. You don't need this buff. I love 7 Ryoshu, but the only benefit is slightly higher clashing on her skills 1 and 2. As much as the skill 1 buff is nice, these numbers just don't matter that much when her clashing is already this great. Hard Mirror Dungeon is the only time this matters, and ideally, you run Chef Ryoshu there anyways. However, that 1 slash fragility on her counter makes her go to the top of the list, baby. Ooh, that's S+++ material right there. Ooh. C tier is for the debatable IDs, Upties you can afford to skip out on for a long time. However, most of them have a team or two they will do well on. Or their buff is just half decent, not particularly good. This buff makes base Heathcliff maybe not terrible for Tremor teams, though what he really needs is to be able to add count. The only thing that matters is the skill 3 buff, which allows Heathcliff to roll the highest clash number out of any of the base IDs, coming in at a 22, barely higher than Otis's skill 3 at a 21. The benefit is that this skill is 2 coins, so it does significantly more damage. You still probably shouldn't Uptie base Heath, but as far as base ID buffs, this one has some real merit. Encliff inflicts 1 more nail on his skill 1, he gets a Gloom Guard, which is a nice color on demand, I guess. Okay, so his passive is the only real change here. However, +1 to final power is good. This allows him to clash on a very impressive level for a 2-star ID, with a 12, 15, and 17 respectively for his skills, and +1 to his ego. This buff, in tandem with the other N-core passive changes, leaves N-Heath in a very solid spot. The problem is I believe Encliff is already one of the better 2-star IDs at Uptie 3, making it all the more difficult to justify using resources unless you are fully committing to an N-core team, like some kind of fanatic. Do you get the joke? Well, we really couldn't expect much from one of the best, if not the best IDs in the game. His buff is incredibly bad, excluding the passive. With 5 or more surviving members of N-core on the team, Enclair very graciously donates some of his immense power to the rest of his crazies, essentially granting them a free damage up buff. It's hard to quantify this, but if you want to commit to N-core, yes, you'll hear me saying this a lot, this is free damage. In literally any other case, this buff does practically nothing. It goes without saying, but Enclair really is just fine at Uptie 3. Finally, L-Core Faust's mediocre passive can actually trigger. Great. Adding poise count and coin power to Faust's skill 1 allows her kit to do more than just use opportunistic slash. Her skill 2 received a mediocre +1 to base power, leaving her rolling an 11 and a 14 on her skill 1 and 2 respectively. This buff does not revolutionize L Faust. In fact, this feels more like they just forgot to add poise count to her kit initially, and are only now rectifying the mistake. But it is decent value. These changes are nothing. Unless you can realistically access 6+ sinking count, in which case +1 coin power on a 3 attack weight skill is not bad at all. Yep, that's it. If you can reach 6+ sinking count and like to use Spice Bush, consider uptying him. If you cannot, then don't. Shidon received some of the buffs of all time. It seems they like Shidon to not have any poise count, and instead she has to rely on RNG critting 1 move, in this case, Overbreathe. The haste value increases are nice, allowing her to consistently reach very high speeds below 50% health. +5 instead of +3 for Overbreathe is a nice, albeit small buff. Rolling a 30 is always great, just ask Ting Tang Hong Lu. Probably the best thing about Shidon's buff is that the majority of her kit has been increased in some way, making this Uptie 4 feel like you got a lot of value. Isn't that what really matters? The C tier may as well be the N tier, considering the majority of N-core IDs seem to end up here. That aside, her skill 1 now inflicting 2 nails if nails are already applied is quite nice, since her nail application was the worst in N-core. Well, out of those who can apply nails at all. The skill 3 buff is interesting, theoretically providing you with +25% more damage with all 5 other N-core members on the team. Add on the Gaze debuff and Fanatic from N Faust, and this skill could theoretically be doing a lot of damage. You do want a full team, which means you want the other N-core IDs to be at Uptie 4, but N-Rodian's team benefit is probably one of the weaker ones overall. G-Core Otis can now find a place on sinking teams, with her skill 3 inflicting a huge amount, 9 total on headset, and she gains coin power against targets with sinking per her skill 1. The base power increase and consistency on her skill 2 is also pretty nice. However, if you don't care for a lot of sinking potency, you probably don't need this buff unless you roll tails in that skill 2 a lot. Now, can someone tell me why her skill 3 doesn't gain attack weight? What a missed opportunity. Yeah, 6+ burn count is pretty steep, but it saves his skill 2 from being utter garbage, making it roll a 14 total instead of a 10. This alone makes the buff semi-worth it, since his skill 2 is what gets the burn count going. The skill 3 increase is marginal, increasing his final power from 17 to 19, but hey, some extra damage is pretty nice. The most disappointing of the Liu buffs, but he's S tier for style points. I have some things to say about this buff. The plus coin power below 50% HP on his skill 1 is really nice. Making it roll an 11 helps Ensult not be a complete dumpster fire when the enemy rolls above an 8. That being said, he has to get below 50% HP. With his massive health pool, this is a bit tricky even with the added aggro. Why not just make his skill 1 good all the time? That's something I will never know. The skill 2 buff is and the skill 3 buff is somewhat counterproductive. Speaking of his counter, why is this unchanged? Give it another coin, something. As it stands, this buff is kind of insulting. "11, 15, 12. Those are the new numbers. He gains some more tremor too. This buff is good, though Merceau still lacks fancy effects like aggro. This is in character, however. No one asked him to be aggressive." The man with the best Uptie 1 art in the game. Becoming highly reliant on one half of his hybrid kit was a bad choice, especially since no aspect of the buff helps him with tremor count. This overall makes Rose Gregory even more reliant on others to stack tremor count while supplying only a little bit himself via his skill 2. Like so many other Rupture characters, he still falls short in keeping the Rupture going. The plus coin power in his skill 3 and the fact that his Rupture application really isn't that bad gets him this high on the list. I underrated this Uptie when I first saw it. I forgot how much one more burn can really matter in burn teams, since stacking is so essential to a lot of the characters gaining coin power now. The plus 1 coin power in Perfected Death Fist is the star of this buff, since that is his best skill by a mile. The base power buff to his skill 3 at least saves it from being a despicable 10 roller. Overall, Liu Merceau will continue to do well for himself, if only he could apply a little bit more burn. Huh? Oh, Capote applies how much burn? Oh my god. Slowing down just a bit, since no one talks about this buff. It actually helps base Rodian a ton. The 3 more bleed and doubling the base power on her skill 3 is huge, since her passive also allows her to inflict 1 bleed at a 50% chance on hit. Every hit. This combined with a little bit of bleed count on her skill 2 means that base Rodian is objectively better than N Rodian when it comes to bleed teams, at least for bleed potency. Seriously, I don't know how no one has talked about this. Her only problem now is clashing poorly and not applying as much bleed count as one might hope. She rounds out the C tier. These IDs generally gain significant enough value on their Uptie to justify being a tier above the rest. There is a mixed bag of situational buffs and all-around buffs, such as coin and base power increases. I'll be slowing down quite a bit moving forward, since there is way more to talk about. Starting off the B tier is an ID I really didn't want to put this high. LCCB Rodian feels like one of the least inspired characters in terms of kit, but this buff is good. And those increases are too good to ignore. A theoretical 13 rolling skill 1 is very nice, especially for a 0-0 ID. The skill 2 becomes significantly better, which does not say much, since I fully believe that Thrust is one of the worst skill 2s at Uptie 3, maybe even the worst. Needless to say, making the skill go from an 8 to a 12 is a huge buff. The problem with skills 1 and 2 is that they do rely on you running blunt, and a lot of it. The largest buff is probably making her skill 3 roll a 17 total if the target has taken no damage this turn. That being said, she is only above average speed, making her value in fights with one target significantly lower, especially if you run someone like 7 Otis, who is incredibly fast. She'll do great in human fights, since an extra skill slot means guaranteeing a blunt skill for your first slot to take advantage of, but she just barely makes it to the B tier, because, simply put, she was terrible before. So demanding! Every single buff to these skills demands a lot of tremor count. If you can provide it and like tremor teams a lot, then this buff is pretty good, though the skill 2 buff is really underwhelming. The real winner is the skill 3. Rolling a very nice 16 total on a 4 coin skill is a common theme in the B tier. The new event IDs do help quite a bit in getting to 10 plus tremor count, but it is still not a sure thing by any means. Though he gains no tremor potency or count increases, he already applies enough potency to justify his presence. Proceed with caution if you choose the Uptie, since you gain literally nothing without sufficient support. 7 Otis's biggest problem in Uptie 3 was her damage. It felt lacking. Now, if you get 7 Rupture, her skill 3 rolls an 18, which does much more damage and clashes at a 20 total. Her skill 2 allows you to slowly increase Rupture count now, which is great since Rupture count is still quite rare. Combine this with the Ebony Stem Ego passive, and you have a core Rupture team member. The main problem with this buff is that it is mostly negligible in human fights, but in boss rush content like Railway, I could see myself running a Rupture team, with 7 Otis on it. I just wonder why it requires exactly 7 Rupture though. Such a weird and specific number. Oh, like the association! Rosespan Erodian joins Enclair and Sunshower Heathcliff in generating 4 sins total with their kits, since Rodian gains a Sloth Affinity Guard. While that is nice, the real buff here is only attainable if you can reach 10 plus Tremor count. The benefit is a slightly better Pierce Cloud Cutter. Needless to say, that is a pretty damn good benefit. Do be warned, just like with Rosespan and Merceau, you need to be able to reach 10 plus Tremor count for this buff to be at all worth it. The extra charge from the skill 1 is not worth your resources, but the coin power is. Again, the event IDs, especially Moeller Sinclair with his skill 3, help significantly with Tremor application. Either way, be smart with your resources. That's kind of the whole point of making this video. Oh, hey, it's that idea I just mentioned. Convenience. Moeller Sinclair is an interesting case. On paper, the buff to his skill 3 seems really nice and the main part of the buff, but the problem comes in reaching that staggering 20 Tremor count, which his buff does help with, but not enough to really get you to the 20. What it does do is get you to 10 Tremor count very quickly, with his skill 2 giving you 2 more self-tremor, meaning 2 skill 2s are all you need to be fully ramped up. This is significant since the main damage from Moeller Sinclair comes from that juicy 4 coin skill 1, as well as the +1 coin power and his skill 3 if you choose to use it. Certainly a solid buff, cutting down the amount of turns this ID hits like his chainsaw thingy is made out of paper mache. 7 Yisang gains some pretty big clashing buffs, and good for him. For being part of the 7 Association, whose director's whole mechanic is clashing, he was terrible at it before. Now he rolls a 12, 13, and a 13. Considering where he was at before, this is significantly better, since in Uptie 3 he was rolling a 9 on that skill 2. Outside of the skill 1 and 2 buffs, there's really not much here, but the increasing clash power on a skill that wants to win clashes to inflict paralysis and to some extent Rupture count was enough to secure him a spot on the low end of B tier. Ting Tang Gang Leader Hong Lu, yes, that is his full name, has gone from a raw damage ID to the raw damage but more damage if they are bleeding from every orifice ID. Throat Slit now rolls a 13, placing it in the high tiers of the skill 1 rolls. Shank, horribly nerfed to be named Jag now for some reason, gains plus 20% more damage if the target has 7 plus bleed, a number that is actually very reasonable, especially since Throat Slit inflicts 4 bleed. Mutilate's change exists, but it's unlikely you'll ever really feel the value of it. His evade, which is already one of the best in the game, has become the bestest in the game, rolling an 18 in theory, and restoring SP on an ID that really wants to hit heads. This buff just further capitalizes on what makes Ting Tang Hong Lu so good. His numbers were already the highest in the game, but Throat Slit, especially rolling a 13, is very nice for him, since the skill 1 is the most used skill. Alongside giving him a home and bleed / nails team to take advantage of that extra 20% more damage on one of the best skills in the game. Now, please change the skill 2's name back to Shank, it was so much better before. Another buff I somewhat underrated on first glance. Sure, the plus 20% damage on a skill 1 of all things is hard to quantify, but you'll be running a bleed team with Kurikumu Ryoshu, unless you're just having a good time. Point being, it is likely you'll be getting to the thresholds you need for a bit of extra damage on all of the skills. The extra bleed count on the skill 2 is the main buff here, becoming consistent and giving 2 more bleed count than before. Personally, I think she could have done with a bit more bleed potency, but don't underestimate 2 more bleed count, since you need a lot of it to keep enemies from running it out. I admit the extra damage conditions on the skills are weird, but it supplements some raw damage on an ID that was lacking it. Overall, yeah, if you want to run a bleed team and you are serious about it, this is a good option. This buff is interesting, making LCCB Ishmael gain benefits on both halves of her kit, those being damage dealer and tank / support. Getting aggro on the skill 1 is a nice effect, and 8 plus tremor allows you to roll a 12. The real buff here is the skill 3, rolling up to a 16 with 5 plus tremor count and allowing LCCB Ishmael to do what she wasn't able to do before, clash. 5 plus tremor count isn't even that hard of an ask, since you're using her skill 2 anyways, which is one of the better tremor skills out there for count and potency. The guard allows you to do something when you're out of ammo, granted that something is sitting there and getting absolutely wailed on, no pun intended. No ammo gain mechanic is a little disappointing, or at least an ammo increase, but I guess that kind of buff just isn't possible. The last base ID, and I know, right? This high up. The buffs are all just simple coin power, but base Ryoshu is a bit unique in the sense that her effects are just really good damage effects. These buffs just double down on more damage and clashing power. The CPI on her skill 3 is especially good, since the slash damage up now gets even more value than before. Her skill 2 now rolls above average for even 2-star IDs, rolling a 14. What really made me put her this high is that this buff is really inexpensive. I'm not saying she's for everyone, but base Ryoshu actually outdamages a lot of the competition, especially with this solid increase. Woofs. She goes in the HPT. Listen, I know no one ever talks about Endon, but this is a solid Uptie. Endon's skill 1 is now officially more hybrid, with its nails and tremor both increased by 1. With her passive and, well, fanatic, this can allow Dawn to be inflicting 3 nails with just her skill 1 alone. The skill 2 buff is something, plus 30% damage is a nice supplement, and her skill 3 inflicts 4 nails total, allowing easier access to that power down and paralyze on her skill 3's final hit, since she only needs to be fanatic or attack a target with 1 nail on them already. This is another one of those Uptie 4s that just feels correct. Every aspect of her kit has been approved and feels synergistic. The only problem is that nails and tremor don't really have any synergy, but Dawn is relatively self-sufficient with her own tremor. This buff only gains more value if you are fully committing to Encore, with Dawn applying some of the most nails outside of Faust. Oh, sorry, LCCB Ishmael. Guess you didn't have enough funding for more bullets. Meanwhile, they give the drugged-up British guy 3 more of them. Sounds about right. This buff seems underwhelming to most on a first glance, but hear me out. At 13 bullets per fight, Heathcliff could do 6.5 quick suppressions with complete optimization. He can now do a full 8. Even outside of only using quick suppression, you can, essentially, use his skill 2 for free 1 time. That isn't all either. I haven't talked much about the defensive skills gaining Sin affinities, because it is mostly just a quality of life change. However, on Rabbit Heathcliff, for optimal damage and things like Railway, you want to use Evade or Body Sack to avoid using up ammo if you need it all for quick suppressions. There are 2 benefits to the Wrath Evade. First of all, free Sin generation is nice, especially Wrath in my opinion, but you also get 1/3 of his very nice passive when you use the Evade, potentially netting you an attack power-up and haste. It's a small thing, but Heathcliff was never going to get a massive list of changes. For what it is, this buff is pretty good. However, think hard about it if you will truly need the 3 bullets. But for clearing big content like Railway and even Hard Mirror Dungeon to an extent, this Uptie is a pretty good bet. Alright, this is the only idea I will actually rant about, bear with me. Kurikuma Rodian really sucked in Uptie 3. She wasn't the worst 000 ID, but she lacked a lot of fundamentals. This Uptie fixes quite a few things, at least theoretically. Firstly, her skill 1 is consistent in giving poise, and gains enough coin power to roll a 14 total if you have 4 poise. Her skill 2 is probably the biggest improvement, giving 2 poise count instead of 1 on use. The coin power also makes this skill roll a 16 total with 5 plus poise, far better than the incredibly mediocre 12 that it was before. The sky clearing cut is good. Lots of these single coin big damage skills just did not work before, since critical hits are hard to guarantee and only give plus 20% damage normally. This actually rewards you properly for getting enough poise and critting. Lastly, her counter gives plus 2 poise count, also on use. It all sounds good on paper, but for some reason I feel like I'm forgetting something. Ah, yes. This passive could not activate before, due to how bad her poise count generation was. So this is a good thing, right? You can use her counter to use a skill 3, and isn't that way more damage? I have bad news. Every character in Limbus Company has this deck layout. 3 copies of their skill 1, 2 copies of their skill 2, and 1 skill 3. The 2 skill 2s is what we will focus on. In an ideal world, Kuroko Merodian uses 2 skill 2s back to back, meaning she would have 10 poise and 2 count after the second skill 2. Now, your skill 2 won't be back on rotation for a little bit, so to maintain your poise, you want to use your counter for the additional poise count. Except, oh no, it is your skill 3. What is worse, to even get to this situation, you need to not crit on the last hit of your first skill 2, or the poise is just gone the next turn. There is a weird way to circumvent this. Instead of using 2 skill 2s like I mentioned, you need to counter first to gain some poise, then the rotation works a bit better. Even then, you're taking damage for 1 poise count. Since you lose 1 at the end of the turn, to poise count, you only gain 1 in the end. And you still need to not crit to gain your benefits. The best way to play Kuroko Merodian is probably using both skill 2s back to back, simply for the coin power increase on the second one, then using a skill 3 or a counter that is turned into a skill 3 for the extra damage. If you somehow don't have her passive active, this is not as much of a problem, thankfully, but in meaningful content, 5 Lust is really nothing, and it's likely you'll always have that. All of this to say, I couldn't put this ID any lower than this. I wanted to, but the benefits she gains, however confusing and not intuitive they are still a vast improvement. She ends up on the high end of B tier, but with a massive stipulation of understanding exactly how she works. Never in my life did I think a buff would simultaneously be better and worse than I expected. First of all, Heath is only required to be below 50% for bonuses, as opposed to 25% before, putting him on equal footing as the rest of the masochists in the She Association. He can also gain poise now, and a good amount of it too. But we're all here for the attack weight on the skill 3. And it's good. It really is. She Heathcliff's skill 3 already hit reasonably hard. Hitting 2 enemies now might just delete them if they are slash weak. Especially at super high poise. His counter allows him to lose health even faster, and though 5 health doesn't seem like a lot to lose, it allows him to get below 50% the easiest out of the She gang. The improvement is vast, but it still leaves him the fundamental problem of having a single coin skill 1 and 2, which leads to low damage. The skill 3 can only carry him so far. It's tough, but the high B tier is where he belongs. When I was thinking about the potential changes Uptie 4 could bring, something I did way too much, I wondered what they would give G. Gregor, since he's between 2 worlds, archetypes, healing and rupture. With Uptie 4, Gregor has leaned heavily into rupture. This Uptie was previously bugged and needed rupture count, but thank God it was changed to potency. Especially since the rupture cutoff is 5, which he exactly applies via his skill 2. This self-sufficiency is unlike the other gain coin power when X number of effect is applied IDs. Theoretically, Gregor can use his skill 2 the turn prior, then go first and immediately reap the reward. The +1 coin power can lead to Gregor rolling a very respectable 16 on Eviscerate, which is very nice for a 4 coin skill and will only increase his healing output more. His skill 1 will now roll a 12 when buffed, which, when combined with G. Gregor's offense level and the plus 40% damage on Clash Win, makes it a very solid clasher and damage dealer. Plus 50% more damage on his member is the cherry on top of this metaphorical rupture-filled cake. On paper, these buffs seem fine. 2 more nails on gripping, 20% more damage. Lust Evade is nice for activating Whispers, but the real value comes from the passive and support passive. Since all of the Encore buffs really incentivize staying with other Encore members, applying 2 Fnatic instead of 1 is genuinely great. Even if it is just Faust and Enclair, adding base power to Enclair is just incredibly powerful. However, the Fnatic is perhaps best used on the weaker Encore IDs. Like mentioned before with Enerodian, buffing her skill 3 is the whole gimmick of her Uptie. 2 base power is massive for a 4 coin skill. It's like having another coin. Heath already gains a final power from being around his friends, add on 2 Fnatic to his already great clashing, and he's rolling an insane 19 on his skill 3. The 2 additional nails on gripping actually synergize with this, making the nails last 1 turn longer on the target than at Uptie 3. The buff to the passive alone carries Faust to the top of B tier. Most every ID in the A tier will net you good value from giving them the Uptie 4. Though, this is a good time to remind you that this is a list based on how much value the ID gets from the Uptie, and is not inherently linked to their strength. That said, a vast majority of the A tier IDs really are great IDs and benefit a great deal from the Uptie 4. Yes, Sun Shower Heathcliff is no Claire. No one is. But he is way stronger now. In fact, the buff from the July 20th patch itself was already pretty significant for Suncliff. Allowing him to lose sanity when losing clashes is really good for a negative sanity ID, alongside base ego taking away sanity. Since his sanity can be lowered much easier, he can now reasonably reach the new massive +5 final power on his skill 2 at negative 25 SP, letting it reach 15 power total. Alongside some other smaller buffs to his sinking gain on his skill 1 encounter, gives him a lot more protection. I know I made fun of Zwei Sinclair for using protection, but he's Zwei Sinclair. This buff leaves Sunshower Heathcliff feeling significantly better about things, by allowing him to go insane quicker. Huh, Limbus Company really is a game. It is a trend that I have a lot to say about Rodian IDs. This is not an exception. Zwei Rodian released and challenged the likes of Sloshing Ishmael and She Heathcliff in a race to the bottom of tier lists. But hey, look at this! This buff makes her a tank that can win clashes and is rewarded for building up her shield in a fun way. What a foreign concept. Her skill 2 has been massively buffed, rolling a 14 total unconditionally instead of a 10, as well as giving her 2 more poise count on use. The skill 3 is also a big winner, having the coin power from shield being at 15 increased to 2 instead of 1, allowing the skill to roll a 17 total, very respectable for a tank. Her skill 1 still clashes awfully, but in this instance, a clash lose effect equal to what you get for winning makes sense, and I like it considering the skill is quite bad. Unlike someone like Sloshing, you get the same thing either way, rather than having to choose between wanting to lose the clash for better effects, or maybe even accidentally winning it and getting worse effects. A fantastic buff that allows Zwei Rodian to occupy a very interesting niche. That being said, if you plan to uptie her at all, commit to taking her to Uptie 4, her Uptie 3 state is pathetic. And also be aware, this is what you're getting. An aggro tank with shield as the main mechanic, alongside some decent damage. This Uptie really is all about the skill 3, which is not a detriment. The way I see it, you should never be using her skill 3 while below 10 plus tremor count on yourself anyways. So gaining another coin power for just playing the ID properly is pretty nice. The skill 3 rolls a 24 with the new bonus instead of 21, which shouldn't matter for clashing outside of a hard mirror dungeon, but it is still a big number. The plus 40% damage at 6 plus sinking instead of 20% is not to be ignored either. This skill already deals a great lot of damage. And the ID has plenty of sinking support, with consistency given to the skill 1 sinking count application, making the 6 plus sinking a little bit more accessible. The benefits are just solid enough to place her on the outskirts of the A tier, but that's mostly because the buffs only get much better from here. Sanct Dawn released the day of Uptie 4, so it makes sense she gains quite a bit of value from it. Her skill 1 can gain a massive +2 coin power for simply being speedy, as opposed to the +1 it was before. As well, her unique mechanic of gaining more damage based on the amount of clashes comes online in Uptie 4, allowing her damage to reach more respectable heights. In addition, everything in her kit becomes consistent, with no reliance on head hits. Lastly, if you can manage to get to 10 plus speed, her skill 3 gains +3 coin power, which gives her a massive 24 on her skill 3. Overall, a great option for Uptie 4, especially since she will bless your Sinner tab with her presence. This buff is as straightforward as it gets, while still being a very solid increase to what W Dawn does best. Rip goes from 2 charge to 4 on head sit, as well as some significant coin power at 5 plus charge. The 2 extra charge alongside leap allows for a turn 3 Rip space. That was previously only possible with telepole or double leap, which is far less likely than starting with a leap and a rip. Of course, the +1 coin power on leap is very nice, since it already dealt solid damage, a bit more damage and higher clashing is going to be welcome. Doubly so, since the charge requirement only requires you to have 7 plus charge, which is very easy to access through many means. Yes, this does not buff rip space, but what did you expect? The Liu 2-star IDs were infamous for being unable to clash and having mediocre damage even with burn. This Uptie fixes that problem for Leo Gregor, allowing him to clash much easier against burnt targets. His skill 2 going from an 8 roll to a 14 maximum is really great for the character's clashing and damage. The skill 1 coin power is nice, allowing it to not roll a pathetic 8, but the biggest buff here really is the burn on hitting heads for his skill 1. 2 more burn doesn't sound like a lot, but considering that it is his skill 1 and is therefore cycled the most, you'll be adding double the amount of fuel to the fire. The consistency for his skill 2 and 3 is also highly appreciated, since 3 and 4 coin skills are likely to miss at least one head hit somewhere along the way. Overall, Liu Gregor is a must-have for burn teams. His potency is unmatched. So, just to make sure I have this straight, Shi Dawn and Shi Heathcliff were objectively worse characters than Shi Ishmael at Uptie 3. Yet somehow Shi Ishmael ends up getting the biggest buff. Shi Ishmael now just gains so much poise below 50% from basically every source. That isn't even the biggest buff in my opinion, what with her skill 3 now rolling into 18 instead of 14, allowing her to clash stupidly well below 50% health, considering Flashing Strike has always rolled a 21. Plus 2 poise count in the skill 2 allows her to gain a massive 8 poise count. Some characters struggle to even get the 4 poise count she gets when that skill is only 2 coins. It's ridiculous that they buffed her this much, and so many others were left behind. It's surprising, but this isn't quite the most buffed 0-0 ID, though she does take second place. Project Moon showing their Hongmu bias once more. His already good skill 1 when hitting someone with 5+ Rupture now rolls a 14, you know, just for fun. The additional base power in his skill 2 brings it in line with skills like Gripping and non-empowered Leap for clashing purposes, which is important for a tank since most of them suck at clashing. The skill 3 finally feels good to hit the extra coin power with, and he rolls a 20 with the buff active, which just puts other tanks like Salt to shame. This Uptie feels like a perfect continuation of Keiko or Honglu's already fantastic kit, and the buffs are actually an important improvement. He doesn't make it to S tier simply because his Uptie 3 kit can almost always get the job done, but that doesn't mean this buff isn't great. Liu Ishmael, the undeniable core of burn teams in the Common Era, whose burn application has not increased, ironically enough. However, her plus coin power effect can now activate twice on her skill 1 and 2. This allows her to roll a 14 on her skill 1, a 16 if her skill 3 plus coin power boost is also active, and a 22 on her skill 2, a whopping 25 with her skill 3 effect active. Given the amount of burn needed to activate these effects is also doubled, from 3 to 6 burn for the skill 1, and 6 to 12 burn for the skill 2. Additionally, her skill 3 does even more damage when the steep 6 burn and burn count condition is met, going from plus 30% more damage to plus 50% more damage. Considering the other Liu IDs have been buffed decently, this ID as a whole is only going to do better. The final 0-0 ID on the list, and definitely the highest rising in terms of viability. Charge was already a pretty strong archetype, considering Telepole Dawn is capable of supplying all of Luxembourg with energy, let alone 5 or even 7 Sinners. W Faust, even with that, just wasn't very good. Her own charge gain was so abysmal. Now, her charge gain is much more in line with W Dawn. Her skill 1 provides double the charge it used to. Her skill 2, which previously gave no charge, and only spent it to inflict 4 bind, now grants 6 charge, spending 3 of it immediately. The biggest buffs come from the coin power increases though. Overcharge rolls a very solid 15, clashing at a 17. Leap rolls a 14, and Energy Cycle has that nice 12, above average for a 0-0 skill 1. She also straps a mini telepole onto her back, since a new line in her passive grants a charge to a random ally after she attacks. Not nearly as good as 10 charge, but it keeps your other charge-reliant allies from losing count due to turn end. Overall, W Faust finds a home for herself on charge-centric teams, ascending from being a burden to an excellent support with potential for respectable damage. Hence, she gets the honor of being, in my opinion, the best 0-0 ID buff in the game. At the top of the A tier. First of all, thank you for making it this far. Seriously. Secondly, sorry, Blade Lineage Sinclair. It was close, but he just barely misses the S tier. There's a lot to talk about here. Firstly, this ID is terrible at Uptie 3. In my opinion, the second worst 0-0-0 ID, only saved from the bottom by one very stoic Warp employee, which is why it's very nice that this is actually a good buff. His skill 1 was one of the reasons why he was so bad. It rolled a 7, now it rolls an 11 or a 9 depending on poise count. The skill 2 introduces a unique mechanic, where if it wins a clash, none of the crits will consume poise count. This is really nice, of course, since it is 3 coins, and the coin power buff makes it a not terrible skill. His skill 3 now truly claims the opponent's bones, getting a massive plus 150% more critical damage if at 10 plus poise count. Then his counter. Uptie 4 likes to try and make defensive skills viable. In this case, it's pretty integral to his kit. It already gave him plus 1 damage up, now it adds 3 more poise count on top of that. Lastly, that passive is fantastic, allowing him to stack poise if you run him with other poise count IDs very well. This buff was difficult to place. It's a huge improvement over the pathetic state of Blade Lineage Sinclair at Uptie 3, however it had to be the top of A tier in the end, since I don't think Blade Lineage Sinclair will be very good even after this. His numbers are a lot better, but they still aren't stellar. You're really relying on that skill 3 to clash. His damage is also going to be somewhat reliant on critting to claim their bones. You see the problem? Just a little too much reliance on making one of his skills really good. It is a great Uptie, though not quite worthy of the S tier. Speaking of, let's see who is worthy of the S tier. Let's waste no time. These are the cream of the crop, a tier reserved only for the IDs who are revitalized or straight up improved upon so much that they could not go anywhere besides S tier. Upon Rhino Merceau's release a week before Uptie 4, I was underwhelmed. His skill 3 especially, rolling only a 15 and expending all your speed juice? Now? Well, now you have a character who generates a ton of charge, with every method of gaining it increasing. And his skill 3 rolls a 21. Oh, and it rolls a 15 below 10 charge, the same as Uptie 3's buffed up number. The skill 2 doubles the amount of charge it generates, which helps his ramp up by, well, about double. His guard is also massively improved, doubling the amount of charge from being hit. And his passive gives him aggro, so you can make doubly good use of his giant health pool. The charge method's increasing allows his X plus speed conditions to trigger far easier, and also being fast is just a good thing for an intercepting tank. Uptie 4 is a massive part of why I consider Rhino Merceau the best hybrid between damage and tank. He stays on the bottom of S tier due to his base kit having enough utility to be able to reasonably get by, but the benefits from the Uptie are insanely useful. Sit down, and let me tell you the story of Blade Lineage Sang. This story tells of those who downloaded Limbus Company in the early days. They opened the game and found sitting in their mail a free Blade Lineage Sang. However, this is not a happy tale, since Blade Lineage Sang kind of sucked ass after the sanity changes went through, considering his ceilings were about as low as my expectations when doing gacha pulls. That was Uptie 3 Blade Lineage Sang. But BL Sang now has the most access to plus coin power ever. Before that, his skills. Firstly, his skill 1 rolls a nice 13 and gives 2 poise count on use. The skill 2 can clash a bit better now, since it rolls an 11 instead of a 9, still the worst part of his kit. And then the skill 3 gains plus 1 coin power, allowing it to clash decently at a 14. But the passive is the main thing. Alongside already gaining plus 1 poise count for winning a clash, every 5 poise count gives his skills plus 1 coin power to a maximum of 3. This means his skill 3 can theoretically roll a 23, with crits interspersed. Perhaps even better, his skill 1 can roll a 16. Combine that with maximum offense level of plus 5, and Yi-Sang can clash really well now, once he's ramped up. His skill 2 can also go from an 11 to a 17. This is the real winner, since winning clashes with the skill 2 before was a real pain. In total, with the passive active, Yi-Sang needs to only go through about 3 or 4 turns of combat to get his first plus coin power threshold. This process is only made easier with an extra skill slot. This change is one of the few I would say is revolutionary to the character, breathing completely new life into an otherwise sidelined 000. Congratulations, Blade Lineage Sang, you get the prize for the 3rd best Uptie 4 in the game. Well, here he is. The first full Uptie 4 shown to us, and it was quite the spicy buff. This buff allowed W. Merceau to gain charge so much easier, giving him 3 charge on use from his skill 1. Previously, it only gave 3 on hit. In addition, his skill 2 now gains plus 1 coin power and 5 plus charge, and his skill 3 got a base coin power increase from 1 to 2, along with the same +1 coin power at 5 plus charge. This makes his skill 3 roll a 17 total. I know that's only one higher than some of the other 4 coin skills that need a condition for extra coin power, but it's so easy to trigger. Needless to say, bringing the worst 000 ID by far into the same conversation as top tier IDs in terms of potential damage is something I never thought would be possible. Seriously, his coin power conditions are stupid easy to trigger, with his hugely buffed charge game. All you need is to rotate one skill 1 every once in a while, or even his guard. Then you can fire off a full power skill 2 or a mostly full power skill 3, barring some of the defense downs. In fact, you can lose the clash on your skill 1. With your passive active, you get the same amount of charge if the enemy uses a 2 or more coin skill. This is probably the most value you can get out of any Uptie in terms of bringing a character from a horrible state to an actually usable one. Second place goes to W. Rousseau. Yeah, who didn't see this coming? Anybody who has watched any amount of Limbus tier list content knows this is the only ID that could be at the top of this list. I mean, seriously, look at the graphic. I could barely fit all of the information on the screen. Her skill 1 now gets to roll a 14. No condition, nothing, just a 14 on a 2 coin skill. Her charge count on the skill 1 is increased by 2 since the on-use charge is new, and she no longer needs the head hits for her charge on her coin 1 or 2. This was less of a problem since the Sandy changes allowed for consistency, but this is a guarantee. Her skill 2 now rolls an 18, generates more charge, and doesn't need head hits for the sinking count application. But really, what we all care about is Lay Funny Mind Whip. No longer does it spend all of your charge arbitrarily, instead only spending 8, and you only need 8 charge to stop Reindeer Ishmael from frying your Rabbit Heathcliff or G. Gregor into rabbit stew or cockroach roast? Anyways, this would already be pretty huge, but they also increase the coin power, making this roll a whopping 26 from the previous 22. Oh, and they made her passive better, so now it's a free attack power-up if you deal damage on the same turn. And they buffed her evade, so that it gives you charge whenever you evade. Seriously, the only thing that wasn't buffed is her support passive. If you have Reindeer Ishmael and you have any interest in using her, yeah, she's a very safe bet. And playing her feels significantly better than Uptie 3 Reindeer. Therefore, she rounds out my list at the number 1 spot. There it is, the full tier list. This took a lot of fiddling around with, since I wanted this to be as accurate as I could possibly get. I'm fairly confident that most of these rankings are correct, give or take 1 or 2 spots. With that, thank you for watching. I hope this video will help someone out there understand the changes as efficiently as possible, as well as their value. If you're hearing this, comment down below how upset you are about base Gregor not being S tier. I think that would be funny. This video ends now.